Welcome to another lecture of Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the concept of race, but focusing on the way in which biology has been interpreted, particularly through the lens of Kim TallBear's work. But first, let me talk about the American Anthropological Association and stand on the concept of race. The AAA, as it is commonly called, states that race is a recent human invention, and by recent, they're referring not to recent history, right, but to the history of humankind. When we think about that time frame when humans first started, when Homo sapiens first sort of started developing, evolving, race was not really a central concept. Rather, is something that some scholars would say that was invented about 500 years ago with the European expansion, right? And that it is really central to the development that would come later on of capitalism and industrialism. The AAA and most social scientists and also most biological natural scientists would say that race is not really about biology. There is no such thing as race that is marked by genes, right? There's no such thing as that, because in a lot of cases there can be more genetic variation between the same population than between population of quote-unquote different races, right? So race is not really about biology, rather it's about culture, and race is about power. Race and racism are embedded in institutions and everyday life. That is, they exist both through official and unofficial forms of discrimination. They exist both through open and implicit bias. But they are there, right? Even if it's cultural, right? Even if it's a so-called social construction, that doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us directly and affect some people more than others. The AAA also wants to say that race is a mode of classification that is linked to colonialism, and the main function of race is to link social inequalities or moral qualities to physical differences, right? So the idea of race as a way in which we are able to sort of connect the morality, the intelligence, and of a person directly to their physical appearance, and then later on this gets translated as a form of social inequality and as differential treatment. Race has institutionalized arbitrary and fictitious beliefs about different peoples. Again, the way in which stereotypes work, right? Connecting the physical to alleged moral qualities and mental qualities. But this is something that's very important. Even if race is a social construction and a human invention, racism is still real and is materialized through systemic legislations, attitudes, and actions, right? So the fact that race does not exist biologically does not mean that racism does not exist. Now, talking about the article that you were assigned for this lecture, right? What is the relationship between DNA, migration, and cultural identity? This is what Kim TallBear wants to understand. The way in which we understand race and DNA through different migration histories, and what that tells us, not about biology itself, but rather about the way in which we use biology culturally, right? The way in which we make these connections between specific biological elements and we give them a culture, right? And we make them cultural. So Kim TallBear is interested is looking at the genographic project that seeks to map migrations and heritage through DNA markers, defining, for example, Native American DNA, African DNA. So this idea that Um, you can you can look at DNA and then give them a cultural marker, right? The way in which this works and the way in which this has become popularized through different projects. And we're going to talk more about that later. So, Kim TallBear finds the following narratives problematic. We are really African. Genetic science can end racism. The vanishing indigents. Genographic project as a collaboration. And you are what you were. So first of all, she wants to say that when we say we're really African, we are doing two things. First of all, we're saying that Africa has always existed, right? But the fact is that Africa, as a concept, is against something that's recent. That doesn't mean that the land that we call Africa now hasn't existed for a long time, right? It has. But rather that using this terminology, he's already reading the past from the lens of the present. So she wants to caution. She wants us to be cautious about that. Second, she wants to say that this is not necessarily a real thing, right? That this idea that we're all interconnected, that we're all African, that we all came from Africa, that doesn't do anything. That doesn't help to fight racism or discrimination based on race. This is something that allows some people to claim, right, that racism doesn't exist or shouldn't exist because we all come from Africa. But again, the emphasis that Kim TallBear wants to add is that this is a way in which we're using biology in a cultural and a political way. She also has this issue with genetic science can end racism, right? The idea that race and racism is just quote unquote bad science, right? That if we only get the truth out there and if we could educate people better about the biology of race and racism and the fact that there's only one human race and not different human races, right? If we could only educate people, then racism would end. And the issue that Kim TallBear and a lot of other scholars have with this is the fact that, again, if race and racism are not about biology, but rather about culture and about power, then education doesn't matter, right? Because what's at the root of the problem is power. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about this later on. Second of all, she wants to establish that in a lot of ways, the Genographic project that seeks to recollect DNA from indigenous populations in the U.S. and in other parts of the world, with the specific hope of establishing in a Native American and indigenous DNA database to then use in different ways. This is sort of arguing, right, that indigenous people are disappearing. But she wants to say indigenous people, and other people would argue the same thing. Indigenous people, Native American people from the U.S., from Canada, from Mexico, from Latin America, from the entire world, right? Their indigeneity, their identity as Native Americans, as First Nations, as indigenous people is not based on DNA, but rather on their belonging to a political community. And the fact that we're trying to get this DNA of quote unquote pure Native American DNA, this is speaking about historical. This is sort of ignoring historical processes and political commitments and political agendas of indigenous populations. And this is connected to the Genographic project as a collaboration, right? She wants to say there might be some groups that are interested in using this biological tool of DNA recollection as a way to establish an identity and as a way to make a claim on a specific territory. But in reality, a lot of this has been forced, and a lot of indigenous populations don't want to participate in this project because they see it, first of all, as intrusive, and second of all, as having potential side effects or collateral damages to their communities. And finally, this idea that you are what you were. And in the videos I'm gonna upload, these are videos of Ancestry.com, where they are trying to decipher, right, who you are based on a DNA sample. That's really complicated. I've taken Ancestry DNA. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but the way in which these TV commercials, these internet ads are making it seem like, well, if you have 18% of X DNA, right, of, I don't know, to give an example, if you have 18% of Spanish DNA, then you're probably want to go to Spain and learn flamenco and eat paella or whatever, right? So this idea that somehow your genes are going to tell you who you are, this idea is problematic for a lot of different reasons, right? Because these genes have traveled throughout the world in different ways, and the fact that now we're making these correlations and then assuming cultural identities based on where we find specific gene pools, that's problematic, right? So even if we're talking, for example, about genes from Spain or from France or from Germany or wherever, right, the fact that we're even looking at these genes thinking about specific countries is ignoring the fact that these countries are really recent, and that not too long ago we didn't talk about those territories as Spain or France or Germany. Well, that there was a little bit of a glitch there, but moving on, I'm gonna upload this video about the Kennewick men, where there's a controversy about the race of human remains that were found in the state of Washington, and that have to do again with this claim of who is the right owner of particular lands. And this matters, right, because here we can see two reconstructions of how that person would have looked like. And on the one hand we have on the right hand we have a reconstruction of the sort of well-known actor, I'm blanking on the name, who's Star Trek, right? So one could say, well, this reconstruction means that they weren't Native American, right, but rather that they were white. And the other one on the left would indicate that perhaps there's some form of racial profiling that would allow us to decide that the person, based on this skull, that the people who lived in this territory based on this skull were either one race, quote unquote, or the other race. And this has tremendous implications for people living there right now who are making a claim to this land, right? So you should watch this video. That's the actor I'm talking about. You'll probably know the name. And like I was saying, you're gonna watch a couple of videos. I'm gonna upload them on the Canvas webpage, and I want you to think about again the ways in which genetic material, biological material that exists, right? That is there, that is real biological material, real genetic material, gets sort of interpreted as having a culture, as having a race, almost as having a nationality, right? So it's almost as if specific genes had a passport, right, or something like that. And you'll see, like for example, in one of the videos, when people discover that maybe they are connected to countries that are next to each other, right? And And you'll see that countries that are next to each other often have really tense relationships. And this is, of course, surprising for people who have been believing their entire lives that, for example, if you're from India, you should hate people from Pakistan. But then later on, they discover that in reality, their DNA is a lot more similar than they thought. And this is, again, the reason, right, that you don't hate people from other countries because of genetic difference, but rather because of political differences that then get mapped on into national identities.